Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going deep, deep into the end of the Vietnam War.
Oh, yeah.
It's the early 1970s. America, they want out after all these years of conflict.
Yeah.
President Nixon, he's promising peace with honor, but, was that even possible? Could things have gone differently?
Right.
Well, that's what we're here to figure out today.
It's a fascinating time. I mean, you really have to consider Nixon's position. He had to get the U.S. out of this war. Incredibly unpopular. But he couldn't let it look like, they just lost.
Yeah.
It was a really tough spot to be in.
Peace with honor. I mean, it almost sounds contradictory, right?
Yeah.
How can you claim victory when you're at the same time trying to, get out of the war?
You've hit on the core issue, right?
Yeah.
That tension in the phrase itself sort of foreshadows all the problems they were going to run into.
Mm.
So one way Nixon tries to manage this is with this idea of Vietnamization.
Vietnamization. Okay, so that sounds like making the war more Vietnamese.
Yeah, in a sense.
Yeah.
The plan was to slowly, gradually pull out American troops and at the same time build up the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN. The goal was for them, the ARVN, to take over the fighting.
Okay, but was the ARVN, were they even ready for something like that? I mean, isn't that kind of like trying to build a house on a foundation that's already, falling apart?
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. And you're right to be skeptical. The ARVN, they had tons of challenges. I mean, they had insufficient training, equipment, low morale. To give you an idea, they had just a tiny fraction of the artillery firepower that the North Vietnamese had.
Right.
I mean, they were going up against a really, really tough enemy.
So even as American soldiers are coming home, the war is not over. Not for the Vietnamese. And this is where Henry Kissinger comes in, right? Nixon's Secretary of State. He's the one negotiating, right, with North Vietnam.
Yeah, absolutely. Kissinger is super important here. And what's really interesting is that he was doing all these negotiations in secret with Le Duc Tho. He was North Vietnam's lead negotiator. And the secrecy, that was super important. They needed to minimize the public pressure, keep everything sort of under wraps so the process could actually move forward.
Okay, so secret talks, high stakes. I mean, it sounds like a spy thriller or something.
Oh, yeah.
But ultimately, these talks, they led to the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, right?
Yeah, the Accords were signed in 73, big ceremony, and that officially ended, at least on paper, direct U.S. military involvement in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And it did look good on paper, at least.
Mm-hmm.
A ceasefire, U.S. withdrawal, return of American prisoners of war. But
There's always a but, right,
yes,
in history.
Yeah, sadly there is. The Accords, they didn't create a lasting peace. Almost right away, fighting between North and South Vietnam, it just flared up again. The agreement, you see, it didn't address the deep underlying political divisions or the fact that there were already North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam.
And then there's the whole thing with the Nobel Peace Prize. Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, they're given this prize jointly in 73 for, the Accords. But Le Duc Tho refuses to accept it. He says there's no real peace. Pretty ironic when you think about all the fighting that was still going on.
Yeah, that Nobel Prize situation, it really shows the disconnect, right, between what the Accords promised and what was actually happening.
And here's what I find really interesting. Nixon ran on a platform of ending the war, but then he actually ends up escalating things. What a twist, right?
Yeah, that surprises a lot of people. But to understand Nixon, you got to see it from his perspective. He thought if he increased the military pressure on North Vietnam, he could force them into a better deal for the U.S. It was a gamble, a risky one for sure.
So what did this escalation look like in practice?
Well, one of the most controversial things he did was the secret bombing of Cambodia. It was called Operation Menu. Starting in 1969, the U.S. started bombing Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army sanctuaries in Cambodia. Now, Cambodia was supposed to be neutral.
Wow, so not only is the war escalating, it's expanding. I mean, I can't imagine people were too happy about that.
No, you're right. When news of this bombing got out, people were furious, both in the U.S. and internationally. The public felt betrayed, and the anti-war movement, it just exploded. To get a sense of the scale, this secret bombing, it dropped more bombs on Cambodia than were used in all of World War II.
That's insane. And then there's the invasion of Cambodia in 1970.
Right. Nixon, he authorized this invasion to try and destroy enemy supply lines and bases. It was a disaster. All it did was destabilize the region even more. It actually helped the Khmer Rouge come to power. They were brutal, and it led to huge protests back in the U.S.
And, of course, those protests included the Kent State shootings.
Yeah, tragically. The Kent State shootings are a stark reminder that the chaos of the war, it was spilling over into America. It was fueling these deep divisions, these really raw emotions.
Yeah. And then on top of all of that, you have Nixon authorizing these massive bombing campaigns against North Vietnam, including, of course, the Christmas bombing in December 72.
Right. These bombing campaigns were devastating.
Yeah.
Just widespread destruction, tons of civilian casualties. Maybe they did increase the pressure on North Vietnam during the negotiations, but the human cost was huge, and it just made the anti-war sentiment even stronger.
It's like everything Nixon did was this calculated risk, like he was playing chess on a global scale. And speaking of chess, wasn't his Vietnam strategy also connected to his Cold War policies, with the Soviet Union and China?
Oh, absolutely. Nixon and Kissinger, they were playing this high-stakes game on a global level. They saw Vietnam as part of this bigger fight with the communist powers. They wanted to use those tensions to their advantage.
So you have Nixon juggling all these things, the war in Vietnam, easing tensions with the Soviets, building relationships with China. It's like a multi-dimensional chess game.
Exactly. So with the Soviets, he pursued this policy called Détente. It was all about reducing tension, arms control, other agreements like the Salty Treaty in '72, limited how many ballistic missiles each side could have.
And then, of course, there's that big opening to China, 1972. Nixon goes to Beijing. I mean, that was a huge shift in the whole Cold War dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. A major, major turning point. This new relationship with China, they were under Mao Zedong at the time. It really changed the global balance of power. And it put a lot of pressure on North Vietnam because they had relied so heavily on Chinese support.
So all these Cold War moves happening while the Vietnam War is still raging, it makes you wonder, did all that diplomacy, did it actually help end the war? Or did it make things drag on even longer? Tough question, right?
It's a complicated one for sure. Historians are still arguing about the impact of Nixon's Cold War strategy on Vietnam. Some say détente and opening to China, it basically isolated North Vietnam, forced them to the negotiating table. Others think those moves actually made the war last longer because they gave Nixon this false hope that he could win through diplomacy, not through the military.
So even with the U.S. pulling out with the Paris Peace Accords, it sounds like South Vietnam was still in a very precarious position.
You're exactly right. Even after the American troops left, the war was far from over, at least for the Vietnamese people. The South Vietnamese government, they had American support, but they were really struggling. Corruption, internal divisions, a weak army, poorly equipped, demoralized. I mean, they were going up against the North Vietnamese army, battle-hardened, determined to reunite the country under communist rule.
Sounds like they were outmatched from the get-go.
It was a tough situation. And the North Vietnamese, they were relentless. In the spring of '75, they launched this huge offensive, just overwhelms the South. And that leads to the fall of Saigon. That moment is really etched in history.
I can picture it, that image of the helicopters evacuating people from the U.S. Embassy roof. It's become this symbol of the war's chaotic end.
Yeah, exactly. The fall of Saigon, April 30 in 1975, that was the symbolic end of the Vietnam War. It was total chaos. Thousands of Americans and South Vietnamese trying desperately to escape. The North Vietnamese army is closing in.
Can you imagine the terror? Those people trying to flee as the city's falling apart around them?
It was a desperate, desperate situation. The U.S. military, they launched this huge airlift, Operation Frequent Wind, to get as many people out as possible. Helicopters on rooftops, ships packed with refugees, just panic and uncertainty.
Yeah, a stark reminder of the human cost of war, even in the final moments. So the war is over, the U.S. is gone from Vietnam, but what about the legacy? How do historians look back at the Vietnam War today?
The Vietnam War, it's still one of the most controversial and debated events in American history. There are different schools of thought. They all offer a different perspective on what caused the war, what it led to, what we can learn from it.
Okay, so let's break down those perspectives. What are some of the main interpretations historians have put forward?
One of the big ones is called the Orthodox interpretation. Orthodox historians, they tend to argue that Vietnam was a mistake, the U.S. intervening in this foreign civil war. They think the U.S. overestimated the threat of communism in Southeast Asia. This whole domino theory thing, the idea that if one country falls to communism, all the others will follow, like dominoes.
So they're saying the U.S. got stuck in a conflict that wasn't really in their national interest.
Exactly. They criticize the U.S. for escalating the war, the bombing campaigns, the expansion into Cambodia. They say it was morally wrong and strategically a failure.
What about the revisionist historians? How is their view different?
Revisionist historians, they have a more sympathetic view of U.S. policy in Vietnam. They argue that the war could have been won, but ultimately the U.S. lost because of things happening back home. Domestic opposition, the negative media coverage, a lack of political will.
So they focus more on the internal factors that led to the U.S.'s failure in Vietnam.
Right. Revisionists, they often point to Nixon's policies,
Yeah.
especially Vietnamization. They say it's evidence that the U.S. could have had a better outcome if they had just kept going.
It's really amazing how historians can look at the same events and come up with such different conclusions. Is there a middle ground between those views?
There is. That's the post-revisionists. They try to offer a more nuanced perspective. They acknowledge that U.S. policy had its problems, but they also say the war was very complex and American power has its limits.
So they're trying to bridge the gap between the orthodox and the revisionist views.
Exactly. Post-revisionists, they stress the importance of understanding the context of the war. The Cold War, what was going on inside Vietnam's own politics, the cultural misunderstandings that really messed with U.S. decision-making.
And then, of course, you have the new left historians. They have a pretty different take.
Right. New left historians are very critical of U.S. involvement. They see it as an act of imperialism, driven by economic and geopolitical interests. They really emphasize the human cost, devastating for the Vietnamese people and for American soldiers.
And they highlight the anti-war protests, those social movements that challenged the legitimacy of the war, right?
Absolutely. New left historians, they see Vietnam as a turning point in American history. When the limits of U.S. power were exposed, the flaws in its foreign policy became impossible to ignore.
So we have all these different interpretations, from those who see the war as a terrible mistake to those who see it as a symptom of a much deeper problem. The Vietnam War, it still casts a long shadow.
It does. It's a source of debate, reflection. It forces us to ask hard questions about using military force, about the limits of American exceptionalism, about the ethical challenges of intervening in other countries.
And it reminds us about the cost of war, not just for the soldiers who fight, but for the people caught in the middle. A story of sacrifice, loss, trauma.
It's also a reminder that history is never simple. And even after the fighting ends, the search for understanding, for reconciliation, it goes on.
Really makes you think, huh? About all the decisions, the paths not taken, and how we're still dealing with the fallout today.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows us how important it is to understand history, not just as some facts on a page, but this whole messy web of choices and consequences that are still shaping our world.
Well, here we are at the end of our deep dive into the end of the Vietnam War. We covered so much. Nixon's peace with honor, the bombing campaigns, the fall of Saigon, the war's impact on America's foreign policy, on the country as a whole. It's been quite a journey.
It has a really complex period, difficult choices, unintended consequences, questions we're still trying to figure out today.
If there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that, the Vietnam War was a failure for the United States. Years of fighting, billions of dollars spent, so many lives lost, and they couldn't achieve their goals in Vietnam.
And that failure, it still affects how America approaches foreign policy, military intervention. It's like a cautionary tale. It reminds us about the limits of military power, how important it is to really understand the political and cultural landscape before we get involved somewhere.
It also shows us that we need to have these open and honest discussions about the real costs of war, for the people who fight, for the societies they represent.
The Vietnam War, it challenges us to think critically about our actions in the world, to consider the ethical implications, to work towards a more just and peaceful future.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought. Could the U.S. have done things differently in Vietnam? Or was it, as some historians argue, just unwinnable from the very beginning? No easy answers there. A question that still sparks a lot of debate and discussion.
It's a good question to think about. It forces us to confront how complex history is, how hard it is to apply those lessons to today. What do you think?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the end of the Vietnam War. Hope you found it insightful, engaging, maybe even a little bit thought-provoking. Remember, history, it's not just dates and names in a textbook. It's a living story. It shapes who we are, how we see the world.
And as we try to understand the legacies of the past, we've got to learn from those mistakes. Seek understanding, reconciliation. Work toward a future where peace and justice win out.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.